a city ruled by fear, a clinic standing alone against the storm. When the Phoenix Syndicate sets its sights on Dr. Victor Hale's small medical practice, they expect obedience. What they don't expect is resistance. But some men don't break. Some places won't fall. And tonight, the battle for the clinic begins. Will he survive the night? Will justice prevail? Watch till the end to find out. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what you would do in this situation. Victor Hale moved with purpose through the narrow hallways of the clinic, his every step measured, deliberate. The air carried the scent of antiseptic, mingled with something heavier: fatigue. The waiting room was packed, as always. A mother rocked her feverish child, an elderly man winced as he shifted his weight, and a teenager clutched his injured arm, his knuckles raw. They all came here for the same reason, because there was nowhere else to go. The city had long abandoned this part of town, leaving only places like this, run by people like Victor, who refused to turn their backs on those in need. He had seen this before, in war zones, in places where governments failed and violence filled the void. It was why he had chosen this life after the military. After years of patching up soldiers under fire, he wanted to save people who weren't holding guns. But he knew better than anyone that war had a way of following men like him. The tension in the air was thick even before the doors burst open. 5 men strode inside as if they owned the place, their presence enough to send a ripple of fear through the waiting room. Conversations hushed. A mother pulled her child close. A man near the door stiffened, eyes dropping to the floor. The leader, a lean man with slicked-back hair and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes, let his gaze sweep lazily over the room before settling on the man sitting on the examination table. Peter Brody. His shirt was bloodied, his face swollen. Victor had just finished stitching the deep gash along his ribs, the kind that spoke of a struggle, of a fight he had lost, and now the people responsible had come to finish what they started. "Damn, Pete," the leader drawled, shaking his head as if genuinely disappointed. "You really ran here? Thought we made it real clear. You don't get to say no to us." Brody didn't respond, but the stiffness in his shoulders said enough. Victor stepped forward, removing his gloves with practiced ease, his movements controlled, steady. "If you're hurt, you can take a seat," he said, his voice calm. "Otherwise, you're in the wrong place." The leader's smirk widened, teeth flashing in amusement. "See, that's not how this works, Doc," he said. "We're not here for a checkup. We're here for you." He gestured toward the shelves behind the counter, where bottles of antibiotics and painkillers were neatly lined up. "You're going to start setting some of that aside for us, every week. No questions, no charge. And when we come in, we get treated first. That sound good to you?" Victor didn't react, didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he let the silence stretch, the weight of his stare enough to make even the leader shift slightly. "This clinic doesn't operate under threats," he said evenly. The leader sighed as if disappointed. "See, I was hoping you wouldn't make this difficult." One of the men, heavily built, a scar cutting through his jawline, stepped forward, reaching into his jacket. The room tensed, patients shrinking into their chairs. Victor had already mapped out the room, measured every movement before it happened. The instant the man's hand went to his belt, Victor moved. A sharp twist, a strike to the wrist. The gun barely cleared the holster before it clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. One of the men lunged. Victor sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and twisted. sending him crashing into the reception desk. Another swung wildly, sloppy, untrained. Victor caught the momentum, drove a knee into his gut, then an elbow to the back of the head. In seconds, 3 of them were on the ground. The leader stepped back, his smirk gone. His hand twitched toward his waistband, but Victor was already moving. A sharp pivot, a strike to the ribs, and the man stumbled, gasping. For a moment, the only sound was ragged breathing. Victor exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He hadn't fought in years, not like this, but muscle memory never faded. He looked down at the leader, now struggling to sit up. "Don't come back," Victor said. The leader wiped the blood from his mouth, his eyes burning with something close to humiliation. "You think this is over?" he rasped. Victor didn't respond. With a final glare, the remaining men staggered to their feet, hauling their unconscious friend with them. One by one, they disappeared through the door. The clinic was silent. Victor straightened, rolling his shoulders. His ribs ached from where one of the punches had landed, but he ignored it. Nia Reynolds, his head nurse, finally spoke. "You know, they're not going to let this go, right?" Victor ran a hand down his face, exhaling. He already knew. They never did. The message was clear before Victor even saw the wall. It was in the silence of the morning, in the way the streets felt heavier, as if the city itself knew what had been set into motion. When he stepped out of his truck and rounded the corner of the clinic, the spray-painted letters glared back at him in dripping red strokes. "Work with us or burn." The words stretched across the outer wall, crude and deliberate, a warning meant for him and everyone who dared to walk through the clinic doors. Beneath the message, shattered glass glistened in the early light, the remains of the front window, now jagged with broken teeth. A dark stain marked the pavement where a bottle had shattered, its contents still seeping into the cracks of the sidewalk. Victor exhaled, his jaw tightening as he took in the damage. They weren't subtle. They wanted everyone to see. Nia Reynolds stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a tight line. She had arrived minutes before him, and from the tension in her posture, she had been standing there, staring at the graffiti, long enough to let the meaning sink in. "This is what we're dealing with now," she muttered, barely contained frustration in her voice. "Terror tactics, petty threats." "They're not threats," Victor said quietly. "They're promises." Ezekiel, EZ. Grayson pulled up in his car a minute later, stepping out with a slow, deliberate scan of the scene. His fingers flexed once before settling into loose fists at his sides. He crouched near the broken window, running a hand over the remaining shards before shaking his head. "They did this late," he muttered. "Smart, no witnesses, no cameras catching them in the act." Nia exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face. "So, what now? We just clean up and wait for round 2? Victor didn't answer immediately. He stared at the graffiti, at the violence etched into the walls of the place he had built. They wanted him to react. They wanted fear. They wanted him to make the wrong move. Instead, he turned away and started walking toward the door. "Clean it up," he said, voice firm. "Keep the doors open." Nia's expression tightened, but she followed without another word. Easy let out a quiet breath before pushing himself to his feet. "Doc," he said, voice low, "you know this isn't over, right?" Victor didn't stop walking, but his answer came firm, unwavering. "I know." The unease lingered all day. It hung in the air, subtle but present, a storm waiting to break. Even as the last of the shattered glass was swept away and the graffiti scrubbed from the wall, the tension remained. Patience still trickled in. hesitant, wary, but in need. The clinic never truly went quiet, not with the steady hum of the city pressing against its thin walls, the occasional cough of a waiting patient, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor in the back room. But now the silence was something else, something unsettled. By nightfall, the neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm, distant laughter from open windows, the hum of passing cars, the occasional murmur of conversation drifting from alleyways. But then, in the distance, an engine roared. Not just one, several. EZ was the first to notice. His head snapped up, his entire body tensing as he turned toward the window. "That's them," he muttered. Victor barely had time to move before the first gunshot rang out. The crack of it sliced through the air like a whip, shattering the fragile quiet. Then another, and another. The sound was deafening, a rapid-fire spray of bullets tearing through the night, aimed not to kill, but to warn. The glass of the already broken window exploded inward, shards scattering across the floor. Bullets slammed into walls, embedding deep into the drywall, sending dust and debris into the air. The tires screeched, engines roared, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. For several seconds, no one moved. Nia exhaled sharply, hands gripping the edge of the reception desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. EZ turned, scanning the damage, his breathing measured but his eyes dark, focused. He ran a hand over his face, then looked at Victor. "They're testing us," he muttered, "seeing how far they can push before you fold." Victor stood in the center of it all, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. Nia finally turned to him, her voice quieter now, but no less urgent. "Malcolm," she said, using his first name for the first time in months, "this isn't just intimidation anymore." Victor inhaled slowly, exhaled just as deliberately. He already knew. This wasn't just a message anymore. This was a countdown. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the walls. The bullet holes in the brick were like scars, visible reminders of the warning that had come in the dead of night. Victor Hale stood in the clinic's waiting room, surveying the damage. The shattered glass had been swept away, the shelves were being restocked, and the bloodstains from those who had thrown themselves to the ground in panic had been scrubbed clean. But the fear? That still remained. It lingered in the way the waiting room wasn't as full as usual. It was in the hesitant glances of the few patients who did show up, and the hushed whispers that carried through the halls. The message had been received. By noon, the phone rang. Nia answered it, her expression darkening as she handed the receiver to Victor. He didn't need to ask who it was. He already knew. Pete's voice slid through the line, smooth and deliberate. "Still standing, Doc?" Victor didn't respond. Pete chuckled. "I figured you might be too damn stubborn to walk away after last night, but let's not pretend you don't see where this is going. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. You don't want to fight this war, Doc. You ain't built for it." Victor exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the receiver. "What do you want?" Pete hummed like he was considering the question. "You already know. You stock what we need. You treat our people first. You stay in your lane, and we don't have a problem." Victor leaned against the counter, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood as he processed the demand. "And if I don't?" Pete's voice lost the last trace of amusement. "Then expect a war." The line went dead. Victor lowered the phone, but the weight of the conversation settled into his spine like iron. When he turned, Nia was already staring at him, her arms still folded, but something else in her gaze now. Tell me I didn't just hear what I think I did, she muttered. EZ, who had been leaning against the doorway, exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. He's coming back, he said. We all knew that. But now it's official. Victor didn't need to confirm it. Pete wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. The day passed in uneasy quiet. The few patients who came in moved quickly, eyes darting towards the boarded-up windows. Nobody asked questions. Nobody lingered longer than necessary. Then, just after sunset, the real message arrived. It started with smoke. A thick, acrid scent that curled through the air like a warning before Victor even stepped outside. He moved fast, pushing through the clinic doors just in time to see the flames. The van, the only vehicle they had to transport critical patients, was on fire. The blaze raged, black smoke billowing into the sky, the heat searing even from a distance. The tires had already melted, rubber curling away from the rims like burned flesh. Someone had done this deliberately. They hadn't torched the clinic itself. Not yet. They were testing him, seeing how far he would let this go before he finally broke. A small group of onlookers had gathered at a distance, their faces etched with unease. None of them moved to help. None of them spoke up. They just watched, waiting. EZ stood near the curb, fists clenched, his jaw tight as he watched the flames consume the vehicle. Nia was a few steps behind him, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable, but her body tense with barely contained frustration. Victor didn't stop moving. He pulled out his phone, dialed the fire department, and gave them the address. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. No reaction, no fear, no acknowledgement of defeat, because that was the one thing Pete needed to see, the one thing he couldn't stand. And that was exactly why Victor did it. The fire had barely finished smoldering before the second move came. The message had been delivered. Now came the terms. Rico showed up mid-afternoon, alone this time. He was dressed cleaner than usual, like a man sent to handle negotiations. He didn't try to force his way in, didn't bark orders. He simply walked through the front door like he belonged there and leaned against the counter, his smirk just barely in place. Victor met him at the reception desk, arms crossed. "You think this is still a conversation?" Victor asked, his tone even. Rico chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, it ain't a conversation, Doc. It's a courtesy." He glanced around the empty waiting room, his smirk widening. "Looks like people are already making their choice, huh?" Victor didn't blink. "Get to the point." Rico sighed as if disappointed. "Pete wants to be fair about this. You had your fun, made your little stand, but now it's time to be smart. If you want to keep this place open, it's going to be under our protection. You need to follow our terms. That means supplies get set aside for us. When we need treatment, we don't wait in line. You don't call cops when things get messy." Victor leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not following your terms." Rico's smirk disappeared. "Then the next fire won't be in the parking lot." The silence between them was thick, heavy, full of understanding. They both knew exactly where this was headed. Victor exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "Tell Pete he should have burned it all down last night," he said finally, "because he's not getting what he wants." Rico studied him for a moment as if trying to decide whether he respected the answer or found it incredibly stupid. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The sun was setting when Nia finally let go of the words she had been holding back all day. "You're out of your damn mind," she snapped, slamming the supply room door behind her as she stepped inside. You could have ended this today. You could have stopped this before it gets worse." Victor was at the counter, going through what little medical supplies they had left. He didn't look up. "You think Pete would have let us walk away? I think you didn't even try." He turned then, meeting her glare with something unreadable. "Are you leaving?" The silence that followed was sharp, painful, real. She exhaled, looking away. "I don't know." That was an answer in itself. She left the room a moment later, not slamming the door this time, and that was worse. EZ found Victor near the back entrance, watching the street. "I made my move," EZ muttered. "They know I'm coming back." Victor didn't react. EZ exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "And they think it's a good idea, which means it's probably a bad one." They both knew it was a risk. "Are you sure you can do this?" Victor asked. EZ let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Nah, Doc, but we're out of choices, aren't we?" Victor didn't answer because they both knew the truth. Tomorrow, the war starts for real. The night was suffocating, thick with anticipation and the kind of tension that refused to settle. The city moved on as it always did, unaware of the war brewing in the shadows, but inside the clinic, everything felt different. The waiting room, once a space filled with quiet resilience, now carried the weight of something heavier, something more dangerous. The people who had come here for help had started keeping their distance, not because they had lost trust in Victor Hale, but because they feared what being near him would cost them. Victor had known from the start that this wasn't a fight he could win through sheer will alone. Pete wasn't an impulsive man like Rico or the others who followed him blindly. He was calculating, always 3 steps ahead, and every move he made was designed to strip away choices until surrender became the only rational outcome. It had been almost 24 hours since EZ had walked back into the world he had tried to leave behind, and the silence that followed was becoming unbearable. There had been no messages, no signals, nothing to suggest that things had gone according to plan, or if they had gone sideways the moment he stepped back into Pete's territory. Victor knew better than to assume anything, but every passing hour made it clear that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. EZ knew better than anyone how to blend in, how to slip seamlessly back into a life he had sworn he would never return to. He moved through Pete's ranks with ease, not eager, not reluctant, just steady enough to be believable. He listened, observed, picked up on the whispers about what was coming, about how Victor had made himself a problem that needed to be solved. He kept his head down, played the role of someone who had finally come to his senses, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending he could be anything other than what he was. But the problem with stepping back into a world like this was that no one ever really trusted a man who had already walked away once before. It didn't take long before the first signs of doubt started creeping in. A few questioning glances, subtle shifts in tone when people spoke to him, the way Rico watched him just a little too closely, like he was waiting for something to slip. And then, just like that, the act wasn't enough anymore. Rico cornered him in the back of the warehouse, the dim lighting casting long shadows against the walls. He wasn't alone. A few others stood nearby, their presence not immediately threatening, but the message was clear enough. "You really expect us to believe you just came back, no questions asked?" Rico's voice was almost amused, but there was an edge to it that suggested he was past playing games. EZ met his gaze, steady but unreadable. "I came back because I got tired of pretending I could be something else." Rico studied him for a moment, then let out a short laugh, shaking his head. See, I want to believe that, but there's a part of me that just doesn't buy it. He took a step closer, voice lowering. And you know what we do to people we don't trust? Easy didn't have to answer. He already knew. That was when the first punch landed. The first sign that things had taken a turn for the worse came in the form of Nia storming into the clinic, her phone clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had turned white. The anger radiating off of her was only barely masking the undercurrent of fear beneath it. "You need to see this," she said, voice sharp, clipped, struggling to hold back the frustration threatening to spill over. She shoved the phone toward Victor, who took it without a word. The video started playing. The footage was shaky, the lighting dim, but the image was unmistakable. Easy, tied to a chair, his face bruised, blood at the corner of his mouth, his left eye swollen shut. He wasn't speaking, wasn't struggling, just sitting there with an expression that carried something far worse than fear. Acceptance. Off camera, a voice spoke, smooth and measured. "Pete, this is what happens when you send a rat into my house." The camera shifted slightly, revealing Rico standing beside EZ, a knife in one hand, the tip pressed lightly against his throat. Pete's voice came again, deliberate and slow. "You wanted a war, Doc? This is what war looks like." A pause, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "Let's see if you're willing to pay the price." And then, just like that, the screen went black. Nia's breathing was uneven, her arms folded so tightly across her chest it looked painful. "So, what's the plan?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His mind was already moving, already sorting through every possible option. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing against his ribs, the knowledge that this was exactly what Pete wanted. He wasn't just forcing Victor into a corner, he was giving him one last chance to fold. Victor looked at Nia, then at the boarded-up windows, at the empty waiting room, at the place he had built with his own hands. And then, finally, he spoke. "We get him back." The plan was simple. Get in, get easy, and get out before Pete could tighten the noose. It was reckless, dangerous, almost suicidal, but there was no time for anything else. Victor Hale wasn't about to let EZ become a warning carved into the walls of an abandoned warehouse. The warehouse loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of rusted steel and concrete, its walls thick with the grime of 100 crimes that had never seen justice. It stood on the outskirts of the city, tucked behind abandoned lots and cracked pavement, a place where things disappeared. People, promises, hope. Victor moved through the shadows, his presence a ghost in the night. The air smelled of gasoline and metal, the distant flicker of neon signs barely reaching past the barbed wire fences. He had been here before, in different places, in different wars. The difference was that this time he wasn't here to save soldiers. He was here to save a friend. Easy was inside. He didn't have time to wait. Victor had studied their movements, spent the last few nights watching, memorizing every shift change, every blind spot, every detail that would determine whether this mission succeeded or ended in blood. Pete thought he was untouchable behind these walls, surrounded by his men. But Victor knew better. No fortress was impenetrable. The guards at the perimeter weren't professionals. They were gang soldiers, dangerous, unpredictable, but sloppy. They smoked at their posts, leaned against the walls, checking their phones, laughing too loudly into the night. They thought no one would come for EZ. They were wrong. Victor moved quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. He approached the first guard from behind, his steps controlled, deliberate. A sharp strike to the base of the skull sent the man crumbling before he could make a sound. The second saw movement too late. Victor slammed him into the wall, muffling his grunt with the crook of his arm, his other hand driving a precise strike to the ribs, then another to the throat. The man dropped, unconscious before his body hit the ground. One by one, he cleared the outer defenses. Not a sound. Not an alarm. Pete and his men had no idea death had just walked through their front door. The main entrance was too risky, too open. Victor moved toward the side loading bay, slipping through the half-jammed door that groaned slightly against its hinges. The interior was dim, the light from a single hanging bulb flickering weakly, casting long, warped shadows against the walls. The sound of voices reached him first. Saw through his act the second he walked in here, Rico was saying, his tone laced with amusement, but underneath it there was something else. Frustration. He thought he was slick. Another voice added, "Thought we wouldn't check his phone, huh?" Moving swiftly through the hall, Victor reached the edge of the main room, pressing himself against the cold steel of a rusted storage container. From here, he could see the setup. EZ tied to a chair in the center, bruises forming along his jaw, his breathing slow but steady. Pete stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching him with the patience of a man who had already decided the outcome. "I don't like traitors," Pete said finally, his voice calm, conversational, "and I sure as hell don't like people thinking they can play me." EZ exhaled through his nose, barely moving. His gaze remained steady, unbroken. "You really think the doc is coming for you?" Pete chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, man. He's smarter than that. He knows there ain't no saving you." Victor moved. He stayed low, silent, his steps precise as he closed the distance between himself and the first man standing guard. A swift chokehold, a sharp twist. The body slumped forward, unconscious before he could register what had happened. Another guard. 2 precise strikes, one to the throat, one to the solar plexus. He barely felt them fall. Victor was already moving toward EZ. Pete heard the shift in movement, his head snapping up. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of knowing when the ground beneath him was shifting. But Victor was faster. The first gunshot rang out, the bullet barely missing as Victor lunged forward, using the confusion to close the final few feet. A fist connected with Rico's jaw, sending him staggering back. But Victor didn't waste time watching him fall. He was already at EZ's side, cutting through the restraints in one swift motion. EZ sucked in a breath, rolling his shoulders the second his hands were free. "Took you long enough." Victor didn't waste time with a response. Pete had regained his footing, his gun already raised. "You think this changes anything, Doc?" Pete's voice was cold, measured, but Victor could hear the crack beneath it, the first taste of uncertainty. Victor didn't blink. "Yeah, I do." Pete smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger, and then EZ moved. Still sore, still aching, but fast enough. He drove his elbow into Rico's gut, grabbing the pistol from his hand before shoving him backward. The shot rang out, but it went wide, shattering a hanging bulb overhead. The room plunged into darkness. Shouts erupted. Pete's men scrambled, confused, blind in the sudden void of light. Victor and EZ didn't hesitate. Using the cover of darkness, they moved through the chaos, slipping between the crates, dodging swinging fists, the sound of bodies colliding filling the space like a storm raging through steel. A gun went off, then another. By the time the emergency lights flickered on, Victor and EZ were already outside, sprinting toward the fence. The cold night air hit them like a shock as they emerged from the warehouse's side entrance. Behind them, Pete's men were still scrambling to regroup. Easy groaned, pressing a hand against his ribs as they reached the alley. "I'm getting too old for this." Victor exhaled sharply, scanning their surroundings, making sure they weren't being followed. "Then try not to get caught next time." Easy chuckled, shaking his head. "Next time? Let's not have a next time." Victor didn't respond, because he knew the war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. And Pete, he wasn't done yet. The gang came just after midnight. Outside, the neighborhood lay still, abandoned to the creeping shadows of the night. The usual city sounds had faded into an eerie, unnatural silence. No passing cars, no distant voices. Even the hum of the streetlights felt dimmer, like the world itself was bracing for the violence about to unfold. Dr. Victor Hale stood inside the clinic, his breath slow, controlled, the air thick with expectation. He had spent years learning to read the quiet before a fight, the shift in energy, the charged static that meant things were about to go from bad to worse. Easy crouched near the door, watching through a narrow slit in the barricade. He had counted at least 3 cars, heavy with men. Rico was at the front, pacing like a man who thought he had already won, barking orders Victor couldn't hear but didn't need to. This wasn't about negotiation. This was about erasing resistance. Then came the first strike. A thunderous bang against the front doors rattled the barricades, splinters flying as the wood strained against the force. A second blow, then a third. The gang wasn't playing games anymore. Victor exchanged a glance with EZ, both of them understanding the unspoken message between them. It was time. The doors exploded inward. Rico led the charge, his men pouring in behind him with the raw aggression of people who believed they couldn't lose. They had numbers, weapons, and the momentum of a victory they had already declared in their minds. What they didn't have was control. The first smoke grenade went off as soon as they stepped inside. A burst of thick gray fog swallowed the entrance, coiling around them like a living thing, turning their vision to nothing but shifting shadows and silhouettes. Confusion set in instantly. Shouts filled the room. "What the—" "Spread out." But Victor was already moving. The first man through the smoke came in wild, a flash of silver catching the dim light. A knife. Victor sidestepped the initial lunge, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting sharply, forcing the blade loose before he drove his knee into the man's gut. He followed up with a swift, calculated elbow to the back of the head, sending him crumpling to the floor. Another came through the haze, swinging blindly. Victor ducked the sloppy punch, pivoted, and sent a devastating strike to the ribs, then another to the jaw. The man hit the floor before he even realized what had happened. EZ was holding his ground near the entrance, fighting with brutal efficiency. A man lunged at him, but EZ was quicker, catching him in a chokehold and using his own momentum to slam him head first into the side of the reception desk. The sickening crack of impact sent another body to the floor. Rico's men had stormed in expecting surrender. Instead, they found war. The smoke had begun to thin, but the damage had already been done. The gang had lost their advantage, their initial charge broken, their momentum shattered against a wall of calculated resistance. But they weren't done yet. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shredded through the barricades, ripping into chairs, embedding into walls, sending splinters and debris into the air. Victor and EZ had already moved, ducking behind overturned tables, using the clinic's narrow hallways to force their attackers into bottlenecks. One of the gang members rushed toward the back door, trying to flank them. Victor saw the movement in his peripheral vision, adjusted instantly. He slipped through the smoke, emerging just as the man reached for the handle. Before he could react, Victor drove his fist into his throat, cutting off the startled gasp, then followed with a sharp kick to the knee, dropping him instantly. Another came at him from the side. Victor twisted, using the attacker's momentum against him, slamming him into a supply cabinet before delivering a precise, devastating strike to the solar plexus. The man wheezed, collapsing, hands clutching his stomach. And then, through the thinning smoke, Rico stepped forward. Blood stained the corner of his lip from an earlier blow, but his expression was steady, his stance solid. In his right hand, a knife glinted under the clinic's flickering lights. Victor met his gaze, already shifting his weight, already measuring every angle, every movement. "You should have stayed down," Rico muttered, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. Victor exhaled slowly, steady as ever. "So should you." Then, without warning, Rico lunged. Rico moved fast, the blade flashing toward Victor's ribs, but Victor had seen men like him before. Fighters who relied on raw aggression, who mistook speed for precision. He sidestepped at the last second, grabbed Rico's wrist and twisted sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, skidding beneath an overturned chair. Rico barely hesitated before throwing a wild punch, but Victor was already inside his guard, blocking with practiced ease before countering with a brutal strike to the sternum. Rico staggered back, gasping, his face twisting in pain, but he refused to go down. He recovered quickly, lunging again, swinging wildly. Victor absorbed the first hit, a glancing blow to the ribs before retaliating. A palm strike to the jaw sent Rico stumbling, but he caught himself, rage flashing in his eyes as he came back harder. The two men moved like opposing forces, colliding at full speed. Every strike was answered with a counter. Every opening was met with a counterattack. It was raw, fast, brutal, no hesitation, no wasted movement. Rico threw a hook. Victor blocked, pivoting into a sharp elbow strike to the temple. Rico recoiled, shaking his head, but refused to fall. He retaliated with a knee, barely missing Victor's ribs before swinging again. Victor absorbed the impact, used Rico's momentum against him, and drove him backward into the counter. Rico grunted in pain, but still refused to drop. His breathing was ragged, his body screaming for him to stop, but his pride wouldn't let him. "You think this is enough?" he panted. "You think you win?" Victor didn't respond. Instead, he ended it. A brutal final strike. A precise elbow to the temple. The impact sent Rico sprawling to the ground, unmoving. As Rico lay there, unconscious, Victor exhaled slowly, turning toward the front door, because he knew who was waiting next. And Pete wasn't going to fight fair. The air in the clinic was thick with smoke and sweat, the scent of blood sharp and lingering. The wreckage of the battle was everywhere. Overturned chairs, bullet-ridden walls, bodies sprawled across the floor, groaning or unconscious. Victor stood near the reception desk, breathing steady despite the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He had fought through everything. Wave after wave of men, the stench of gunpowder clinging to the air, the raw violence Pete's men had brought with them. But now, the real fight was about to begin. The front doors swung open. Pete walked inside. He didn't rush, didn't move with the aggression of a man who had just watched his entire crew be dismantled before his eyes. Instead, he walked forward with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once considered losing. His steps were slow, calculated. Victor didn't move. He didn't have to. Pete exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "All this," he murmured, voice smooth, untouched by the chaos. For what? Victor said nothing. Pete clicked his tongue, taking another slow step forward. I gave you chances, Doc. I gave you options. You could have taken the deal. You could have walked away. His eyes flicked down toward Rico, unconscious at Victor's feet. But instead, you threw everything away. Victor exhaled through his nose. Steady, calm. I did what needed to be done. Pete's smirk twisted, and then he moved. The battle may be over, but the war is never truly won. The scars remain, the wounds still fresh, and the city watches, waiting for what comes next. Dr. Victor Hale stood his ground, but at what cost? Will peace last, or is this just the calm before the next storm? What do you think happens next? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories of justice, survival, and the fight against injustice.